What's up, Psychedelic Investors? My name's James, and you're watching The Psychedelic Investor, your #1 news source for psychedelic medicines. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about a new psychedelic medicines ETF which is hitting the market, a new psilocybin study, some LSD studies, and will MAPS turn into a public company and have an IPO? We have all that and more for you in this episode, so make sure you stay tuned. But first, if you enjoy this episode and you want to see more like it, make sure that you like, subscribe, and hit that notifications bell, or else I'll steal your girlfriend. Enjoy the episode. Our main story tonight is that a new psychedelic medicines ETF has hit the market, and this is the very first American ETF focusing on psychedelics. It's called the Defiance Next Gen Altered Experience ETF, and it's traded on the New York Stock Exchange under the ticker symbol PSY or PSY. The ETF, quote, seeks to track the beta medical psychedelics, cannabis, and ketamine index, a rules-based index that tracks the performance of companies listed in North American exchanges that operates business models focused on the legal usage of psychedelics, cannabis, and ketamine for therapeutic purposes. In order to be included on this ETF, companies must have a minimum market cap of $75 million, and they must produce, distribute, or offer services related to medical psychedelics, medical cannabis, or ketamine and its derivatives. So the first thing to note and to be cognizant of is this is not a pure psychedelics ETF, as it also includes marijuana companies. In fact, if we look at the top holdings of PSY, we see that the top 3 companies are companies that involve marijuana, CBD, or other cannabinoids. These top 3 holdings are Charlotte Webb's Holdings, Aurora Cannabis, and Kronos Group. In fact, in order to find the first pure-play psychedelic medicines company, we need to go all the way down to the 5th spot, where we will find MindMed, followed closely by Compass Pathways. Each company has about 5% of the total ETF. So I'm going to give my general thoughts on this new Defiance Next Gen Altered Experience ETF, or PSY, and I have one positive thought and one negative thought. Starting with the positive thought, this is great for the industry. The more ETFs that we have tracking the space, the better. Importantly, this gives American investors access to a wider basket of psychedelics, even Canadian ones, which frankly they just don't really have access to at the moment. This ETF is also going to include OTC stocks, which Psil, which is run by Advisor Shares and will be going live sometime in the near future, won't. This is important because most psychedelic medicines companies are currently traded on the OTC market. And if you want to track the performance of medicinal psychedelics companies, you need to be tracking the markets on which they're traded, which at the moment, for the most part, is the OTC, over-the-counter market. Moving on to my negative thought about this, I don't like how this is not a pure-play psychedelics play, with a majority of the companies being involved here being cannabis companies. We already have enough cannabis ETFs that exist, so we don't really need another one. We don't need this psychedelic medicines ETF to be diluted by these cannabis companies. In fact, 65% of this ETF are companies working with marijuana, while only 35% of the company are psychedelic companies. Still, this is great for the industry, and a major shout out to Defiance for creating this ETF. Nevertheless, I'm still waiting for the Psil ETF. Hopefully that will be more heavily weighted towards psychedelics, though that ETF will also include cannabis. One of the core problems for retail investors in the psychedelic space right now is the fact that we're still 5 to 10 years away from commercialization of these medicines. And frankly, we just don't know which companies are going to be the ones that end up being successful half a decade in advance. Yes, of course, we have some good guesses, the companies that are currently the furthest advanced in their scientific endeavors, such as MindMed, Compass, and Atai. But we just don't know. And that is why the idea of investing in a broad psychedelic medicines ETF is so appealing. We can spread our risk, and hopefully the successes of the few will more than make up for the failures of the many. The main problem I have with the Horizons ETF, so the other ETF that's tracking psychedelic medicines, Psych, PSYK, is that it's passively managed, although it is solely focused on psychedelics. So the fact that it is passively managed means that they're giving higher weighting due solely to the size of each company's market cap. So often the market, especially in the short term, can be stupid and give excess value to some companies that don't deserve it, and not give enough value to companies that do. So personally, I am waiting for an ETF which is purely focused on psychedelics and is actively managed not only by financial gurus, but also by medical experts experienced with psychedelic medicines. This way, we can have scientifically literate people looking at the details of the 20+ different companies in the field and deciding which companies are most likely to succeed in half a decade based on their previous and current scientific work, and then as these experts' opinions change and shift, we will see the makeup of the ETF change as well. But until we get that, you know what? It's nice to have ETFs like the Defiance Next Gen Altered Experience ETF that includes psychedelics even if it's not solely focused on that. So guys, let me know down in the comments whether you're planning on investing in Psy. Why or why not? I want to know. Is MAPS considering an IPO? The idea might seem like a stretch, but that is exactly the topic of this segment. As a reminder, MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, is quite possibly the leading psychedelic medicines research institution in the world. Through their decades, both of advocacy and research, they are perhaps the group the most responsible for our currently changing paradigm, where psychedelics like LSD, Psilocybin, and MDMA used to be viewed as dangerous, addictive substances, and are now slowly starting to be seen as medicines. And this, like I said, is much in due to the work that MAPS has been putting in over decades. For example, they recently completed a phase 3 clinical trial testing whether PTSD can be treated with MDMA talk therapy. And this trial had phenomenal results, where 67% of patients were cured of their PTSD and another 21% saw an improvement, though they were still diagnosed with the condition. Though they have been ultra successful, MAPS is not a for-profit company, but rather they are an NGO that operates mostly off of donations. And after being a widely successful charity, why would they decide to change now? Well, I have a huge shout out to the Reddit user Pinecones Domes who caught this. He watched this 2-hour-long video, which has less than 100 views on YouTube, to find a 2-minute golden nugget clip. So I'm going to go ahead and share you this clip now.
Grams of MDMA from us. And I was like, what do you want to do with 2 kilograms of MDMA? I thought, okay, 40 grams, 50 grams for sure. But so anyway, we're in negotiations with them, trying to figure out what's going on there. But it's pretty amazing. And as you look everywhere, Field Trip has just raised $95 million. Numinous has just raised $40 million. We're struggling to raise a few millions now. So we have a big plan about all different ways that we can raise new funding. We think we want to raise $100 million over 3 years. And we're looking at philanthropy, we're looking at loans, we're looking at IPOs, we're looking at all these different ways. IPO changes everything that we've been doing. We have so much volunteer labor. If a group of people are making money, then why should people volunteer? And but if we borrow money from a loan, then we're not selling equity, we pay the loan back. But people have to trust that we're going to get approval, so which we don't have yet. So we need loans to get approval, and so people would be risking their money. So it's a different kind of people willing to loan it, although the Nature Medicine article and our data suggests that we're probably going to make it. So anyway, that's our big thing, is what do we do? In a case where all these for-profits are making, we've raised 40 million in the last 2 years. For-profits have raised over $1 billion. And that's just the difference of scales. And that's why people are hiring away our staff at double the salary of what we're paying. We can't afford to match it. There's all sorts of new pressures now that the rise of the for-profit. So overall, I think we're just in great shape. We will be able to publicize the Nature Medicine, but the main thing to say is just that things are really changing in a good way, and we just have to put a massive focus now on increasing enrollment in MAP2 as quickly as we can.
As we already discussed, MAPS is not a for-profit company, but rather an NGO that's focused on research. Now, ideally, we would want it to stay that way, as their goals of spreading psychedelic medicines to the world may conflict with a profit-based motive of a publicly traded company. Doblin, in this clip, talks about an IPO in sort of a last resort manner. He explains that they have the problem that they need to raise $100 million over the next 3 years, which can be hard for an NGO to do. So of course their first option would be to do this through charity work, but raising tens of millions of dollars a year for a charity is very difficult, even for the most successful charities in the world. Failing this, their next option would to try to get a $100 million loan. That option, however, would be complicated by the fact that very few banking institutions would be willing to give such a large loan where there is A, no FDA approval yet, and B, to a charity that isn't necessarily trying to make the money back to pay back the loan. So, despite being one of the leading institutions pushing the frontiers of psychedelic medicines over the course of decades, raising the tens of millions of dollars necessary has been very difficult. And that is while private companies like MindMed, Atai, and Compass Pathways have managed to attract over $1 billion. So if MAPS fails in raising this $100 million or getting a loan, they may someday change into a private company to fund their research and develop these next generation drugs. But hopefully it won't come to that. If they do go public, I would, don't get me wrong, 100% invest in them. How could I resist? But I actually hope this doesn't happen. Frankly, when it comes to psychedelic medicines, we need an all-of-society approach here. And while public, for-profit companies, of course, play a role, that's the thesis of this entire YouTube channel, we probably also need institutions operating on an ethics system that is not centered around the profit motive. So I actually have a solution to this, a potential suggestion that I would like to give MAPS and the governments of the United States. It's, as we see states like Texas and New York debate legislation to set up institutions to study psychedelics, these states should partner with MAPS and fund them to do the research. This way, the science isn't corrupted by the profit motive, and the states have one of the best and most knowledgeable institutions in the world running these studies. So again, this is just a hypothetical that was discussed on a YouTube video that literally nobody watched. But it does point to this being a discussion that is happening within MAPS. So we're going to keep an eye on this story as it evolves and as we get new information, and of course, anything that we learn we will pass on to you. I would generally expect this not to happen, especially anytime in the near future, but who knows? It's a possibility. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Should MAPS become a private company? Let me know why or why not. And if they do IPO, are you going to invest in them? I know I will. Let me know down in the comments. As any viewer of this channel will know, psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy to treat depression is a treatment that has great potential. But just how effective is this? Well, luckily, that's the topic of a brand new study that found that psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy is 4 times more effective than typical antidepressants. This study was conducted at the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research at Johns Hopkins University at their Bayview Medical Center in Baltimore. This study had 27 patients who were all adults diagnosed with MDD, major depressive disorder, between the ages of 21 and 75 who were not already taking antidepressant medications and had no history of psychotic conditions, major suicide attempts, or hospitalizations. All participants were randomized into 2 different groups. The first one received the treatment immediately and were compared against a group that did not as a control group. But what's interesting about this study, as compared to a lot of the other ones I've seen, is that after the first group underwent the treatment, and after all the analysis was done and 8 weeks had passed, they actually put the second group through the treatment regime also. Now, in this study, to measure depression, the researchers used something called the Grid-Hamilton Rating Scale for Depression. Now, this assesses different aspects of depression, such as depressed mood, anxiety, guilt, sleep, appetite disturbances, and suicidal tendencies. The treatment lasted 8 weeks and included 2 day-long administrations, spaced approximately 10 days apart. The doses of psilocybin used were 20 milligrams per 70 kilograms of mass and 30 milligrams per 70 kilograms of mass. And this, of course, was paired with talk therapy. Measured 4 weeks after treatment finished, 71% of people saw a clinically significant reduction in their depression. Crucially, after 8 weeks, the same 71% of people still had a significant reduction of their symptoms. Even more impressive, if it could get more impressive, is that after 4 weeks, a full 58% of people were in remission, though this did drop to 54% after 8 weeks. These are extremely impressive results, and in fact, this is 4 times more effective than current treatments, such as SSRIs. And this replicates and expands upon earlier studies, such as the one published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which we have discussed before on this channel. On top of this, when measuring anxiety levels and other secondary measures, similar results were found. Now these are insanely good results, and if these hold on larger samples going forward, then it seems like it's only a matter of time before psilocybin therapy enters the mainstream. For retail investors and those hoping to see better treatments for depression and anxiety, this is about as bullish a sign as can be imagined. Over 50% remission 2 months after treatment? These are unheard of numbers. Nothing compares to this. So let me know down in the comments whether you would ever consider undergoing psilocybin talk therapy. So, we have a new study that's looking at how LSD affects the brain, and it is extremely interesting. This study was conducted at Cornell University, and it looked at fMRI scans of the brains of people who were currently on LSD as compared to those who were on a placebo. And like I said, the results extremely interesting, so I'm going to go ahead and share that with you now. So what the scientists found is that when people are under the influence of LSD, the regular barriers and constraints that are present in our thinking processes evaporate. Regularly, when our brain is fed new information or sensory data, it goes through your regular thinking processes that we have built up over the course of our lives. And this helps organize data into a form that makes sense of our reality. For example, when you walk into a room that you have never been in before, you're still fairly certain that the walls around you aren't just going to all of a sudden start to move and merge and shift shapes, even though you have never seen those particular walls before. You don't have to stop and think, gee Bob, I wonder if these walls are going to randomly start turning into different shapes and forms and stuff. And that's because in your life, generally, walls have never moved before. So this is an extremely important job that our meat computers are executing all the time, as it allows us to focus on more pressing matters in our day, like whether or not that gorgeous dog your friend Matt bought will let you pet him. I mean, look at him. Who's a good boy? Okay, so in general, and I'm grossly oversimplifying here, of course, our brains operate on 4 levels. 2 of those levels focus on processing the sensory data that your 5 senses are accruing, and 2 of the levels focus on making sense of that data based on your prior experiences. Usually, the conscious part of our brain is focusing on the latter, subconsciously incorporating all the new data into our already predefined perceptions about reality. And switching between these different levels within your brain, it's possible, it's doable, we do it all the time, but it does take vast amounts of energy. So when a patient is on LSD, there's actually 3 primary effects. First, the brain tends to stay in the sensory levels of consciousness. It's focusing more on the actual data that it's receiving, less so on the integration of that data into your perception of reality. And for anybody that has actually tried a psychedelic before, this could help explain why you feel a sense of wonder sometimes when you look at something as mundane as a tree. Since we see them every day, when we see a tree in real life, we don't actually focus on the million beautiful little details that the best artists in the world wouldn't be able to replicate. But we just pass this over because we have a conceptualization of what a tree is. Our higher level brain functions have categorized this into what we call a tree, and our conscious brain doesn't focus on the sensory data. But when on a psychedelic like LSD, when your brain is in sensory data mode, you focus on the details of what makes a tree, and often you can get the feeling of seeing something or seeing an object for the very first time. The second main effect is the lowering of energy levels or barriers between the 4 different states that your brain switches between. You can conceptualize this as the landscape of your brain being flattened. As a senior author of the paper, Dr. Amy Kusutsky says in an interview with The Guardian, it allows us to move more freely and have more dynamic brain activity. This means that the brain is taking pathways that it would not usually take and allows us to break free from previous thinking patterns which have become institutionalized within our consciousnesses. And finally, the third effect is basically just a combination of the previous 2. When your conscious experience focuses more on the reading of the sensory data than it does on the integrating it into your previously determined belief structures, and your brain is more easily flitting between the different states of consciousness, our brains begin acting in a way that is much more akin to how young children see the world. It's much more akin to how young children are discovering the world than it is of adults trying to survive it. David Nutt of the Imperial College of London, who is not involved in this study, says that the flattening of your brain's landscape allows parts of your brains that haven't interacted with each other since you were a child to begin to do so again. He said to The Guardian that, quote, "The whole process of child development and education is to take your brain, which is extremely malleable, and force it to be like everybody else's brain. Under psychedelics, you go back to a state where bits of the brain that haven't spoken since you were a baby can crosstalk. And it is that increased connectivity that allows people to get new insights into old problems." So this is extremely important for treating mental health issues that are defined by rigid and obsessive thought patterns, such as depression, anxiety, PTSD, and OCD. Speaking of depression, Dr. Nutt says, people get locked into a way of thinking that is repetitive and ruminative. It's like tramline thinking. Psychedelics can disrupt those kinds of processes so people can escape from it. So this is a very cool study which was completed, and it gives us insights into what our brain is actually doing when we're on substances like LSD. So what do you guys think? What do you think of this explanation for what is happening in your brain while you're on LSD? Does it make sense to you? Let me know down in the comments. For our final story today, we're going to be looking at 2 updates on legislative changes regarding the legality of psychedelic substances. The first comes from California, where the Senate has approved a bill to legalize the possession of psychedelics like psilocybin and LSD. And we've actually been covering this bill for months now, basically. And we're doing this because it's perhaps the most ambitious decriminalization effort in all of North America and perhaps the world. So this bill would, quote, remove criminal penalties for possessing or sharing numerous psychedelics, including psilocybin mushrooms, DMT, ibogaine, LSD, and MDMA, for adults 21 years old and older. So basically it would decriminalize the use and sharing of most psychedelics, though selling it would still be illegal. For psilocybin specifically, the bill goes further and basically legalizes the cultivation and transportation of psilocybin mushrooms, though again, selling them would still be illegal. It's important to note that this bill was watered down a little bit in its negotiations phases. Originally, it included pardons for anyone convicted of an offense that this bill now makes legal. But like I said, in the negotiations phase, for some reason, they scrapped this. This does make me a little bit frustrated as I see no reason to drop this provision. But having said that, the bill as it stands now is still very good. Now the bill must pass the House and probably go through infinite committees in the House as well, and then eventually be signed by the governor. I'm hopeful that this bill will eventually pass, and if it does, California will become the most forward-thinking state in the entire nation when it comes to psychedelics. But even if it does, the party ain't over, and that's because a group of activists are working on getting Californians to vote themselves on setting up a legal psilocybin market in the state where adults can buy and sell the substance. If these activists are successful, Californians will be able to vote on this directly in 2022. Moving over to the state of New York, we have a new bill that's been put forward there that proposes state-sponsored psychedelic research institutes. This bill was introduced by Assemblywoman Linda Rosenthal, and it would require the state to create a research institute to investigate the therapeutic potential of psychedelics for people struggling with a substance use disorder, including methamphetamine, opioids, and other addictive substances. Researchers would also be required to conduct clinical trials into the therapeutic potential of psychedelics, develop training programs for professionals who would work with the substances, and to establish an advisory board to provide oversight of clinical trials and to assist principal investigators at sites lacking formal institutional review board oversight. So, explaining why she tabled this bill, Rosenthal says, there is a growing evidence to suggest psychedelics, including psilocybin, can be a useful tool in treating the symptoms of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and to help individuals recover from a substance use disorder. Psychedelics provide a host of benefits without the same risk of overdose or dependency that other medications may provide. So this is actually the second important psychedelics bill to be introduced in New York. The other, which was also introduced by Rosenthal, aims to decriminalize both psilocybin and psilocin, two of the main psychoactive ingredients in magic mushrooms. So, I don't really know how likely it is for these two bills to pass, though I would suggest that this new one is more likely just because it's less radical. Either way, hopefully our representatives in New York have the courage needed to pass these bills. Frankly, I don't really have high hopes, but hey, you never know. California is surprising me and Texas surprised me. So, If you live in New York, I would definitely suggest finding out who your local representatives are and writing them. Tell them that you support this bill. And let me know down in the comments if you think that these much needed bills are actually going to pass, or if you think our politics, our crony politics, is going to screw this up as we're so used to seeing. Alright guys, that is all for today's episode. I really hope that you enjoyed everything. Let me know down in the comments if you did enjoy it, and make sure you're liked and subscribed. Reminder, I will steal your girlfriend if you don't like and subscribe to this video. And if you want to see more of me, click on one of the videos you see on your screen now. Bye guys, I love you all so much. I'll see you soon. Peace.